It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Assistant Professor Bernadette Hanlon. Professor Hanlon first came to OSU in 2011 as the Trott Visiting Professor, and then was hired in a tenure track position in 2012. Her work looks at suburban transformation, and this is really taking into account where a lot of the work that's done in urban areas and the suburbs focuses on growth, places that grow, and places that are places of opportunity and places of success. And her work looks at the places that aren't succeeding in the suburbs, the inner-ring suburbs, the problems of metropolitan fragmentation, and also what are the metropolitan experiences of suburbanization around the world. She's an author of 3 books, the first of which was with Cities and Suburbs, New Metropolitan Realities in the U.S., which she wrote with Tom Vicino in 2010, and based upon her dissertation research, Once the American Dream, Inner Ring Suburbs of the Metropolitan United States, also in 2010. Most recently, she has published a book again with Tom Vicino in 2014, Global Migration, The Basics, and this book is a textbook for undergraduates, but is really also a foray for her into thinking about what immigration's effect has been on metropolitan transformation, and is really leading the next stage of her research. She has a bachelor's degree from, I get confused, her master's and her bachelor's degree from University College Dublin, a master's in philosophy from Trinity College in Dublin, and a master's and a PhD in public policy from the University of Maryland. And I look forward to hearing her, and I give her to you, Bernadette Hanlon.
Turn on this mic. Can everybody hear me? Everyone here? Come on down. No. Yeah, I'm like Madonna here with this new headset, so I might break into song a little bit later. Thanks, Rachel, for the introduction. I'm really actually very happy to be here to get a chance to talk to give a lecture at Knowlton. It's always nice to give lectures to people that you recognize. It's like giving a lecture to your family, which I kind of do on a regular basis. It's always nice to share my work and kind of get your ideas and thoughts about it. What I'm going to talk to you today about is actually suburbs, no less, after that introduction. And what I'm really going to focus on is suburban redevelopment, which is not a new area for me, but this is based on some work that I've been doing with Whitney Airgood O'Bricky, who's in the audience here. She's our PhD student in the City and Regional Planning Program. And this is work that we've been doing that's actually hopefully going to be published in JAPA at some point. We're revising and resubmitting this paper, so I'm very excited to share it with you tonight. So to talk a little bit about what I'm going to speak to you about, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the literature that's been written about suburban redevelopment, and talk to you about a case study. And this is a case study that we did in Baltimore in Maryland, and I actually wish to thank the Knowlton School and the Voss Award for helping us to travel back and forth to Baltimore to do this work. So this is some of the work that myself and Whitney have been doing. We're going to talk about the case study and then speak to some of the kind of so what kind of elements of our case study. So as Rachel mentioned, there is a sort of emphasis on suburban growth as an element of suburbanization, and this is an image here of Levittown in Pennsylvania from 1959, an aerial shot of Levittown. And mass suburbanization began, I suppose, in the post-war period, where you had suburbs prior to that, but on this kind of much larger kind of scale development, you saw happening during this kind of post-war period. And often a narrative has been created in some ways by this post-war suburbanization that sort of looks at suburbs as homogenous, kind of sprawling development. And there's lots of reasons for that, right? Because it kind of looks like a pretty homogenous, sprawling development. But in my work, I've sort of emphasized some of the kind of heterogeneity of suburbs, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I go through some of this talk. But also suburbs have been critiqued at the time of this post-war suburbanization for their effects on the environment. There's a really interesting book called A Bulldozer in the Countryside that kind of talks about how the rise of post-war suburbanization kind of aligned with the rise of the environmental movement, which is quite an interesting kind of way that suburbanization is kind of linked to that issue of environmental pollution and other types of problems. And that is still the case today. We worry about suburban sprawl and its effects and its environmental effects on air pollution, for instance, or the loss of open space, and so on. So suburbs are therefore, I would say, very much a part of a sort of sustainable metropolitan agenda. And I think we kind of need to sort of really consider these places when we think about sustainability. So yet, I think suburban growth, however, is only one aspect of the suburbanization process. Another process of suburbanization, and one that's kind of received quite a lot of recent sort of media attention and sort of concern among scholars, is the rise of suburban poverty. And so this is sort of in line with some of my own work, but essentially what some of the recent kind of work that's come out of the Brookings Institution has sort of shown is that there are more poor people now living in suburbs than in cities. And this is sort of a phenomenon that really sort of starts to emerge in the beginning of the 2000s. So certainly I think the Great Recession has had a real impact on suburbs, the housing foreclosure crisis, as well as the unemployment related to the kind of Great Recession has affected suburban areas as much as it has urban areas. But also I think my work has shown a little bit about how certain places have actually been experiencing decades of suburban decline. And really suburban decline, I think, began in some of these places going back as far as the 1980s. And so my work has sort of looked and examined that process. And so I think in some of the places that I'm going to talk about tonight, they've experienced in some ways much of this type of decades of disinvestment that's been going on. So alongside then suburban sprawl, which we kind of talk about a lot in terms of our narrative about suburbs and suburban growth, there's also this issue of suburban decline. And what I'm going to talk a bit about is about how these two processes of growth and decline kind of intersect with this idea of suburban redevelopment. And I'll get back and probably show you this fantastic visual later. This is one of my favorite slides. Only kidding. So, so along with these processes, and so what I'm going to show are these varied forms of redevelopment in the context of these older suburbs in Baltimore. So one of the things that's been going on lately in some of the research on suburbs is that actually we've really entered into a post-suburban era. In some ways, a kind of era beyond the suburban era, or after the post the suburban era. And this post-suburban era that people have been talking about sort of recognize the emergence of new spatial forms that are happening within metropolitan regions. Edge cities, which some of you may have heard of, or edgeless cities is another one. So these emergence of sort of continuing that sprawl that I talked about, but also the emergence of employment centers, the decline of these inner suburbs, and at the same time, you're seeing a kind of resurgence of cities and a kind of resurgence and gentrification of cities. So in a way, people are sort of suggesting that the metropolis, the US metropolitan region, is getting in some ways turned inside out, right? And so this great inversion that people are kind of discussing. And one way post-suburbia is manifest is really in the redevelopment also of suburbs, and this idea of making suburbs in some ways more like cities. And this is a kind of avenue of research that I think is ripe for any of you PhD students out there. I would argue that we potentially are making our cities more like suburbs. And so this is sort of an interesting dynamic that's happening. But all of this transformation, I think suburban redevelopment is one aspect of this change that's happening. So in the policy realm, because of this issue of suburban sprawl and the negative environmental effects of that, there's been an emphasis on encouraging redevelopment under the rubric of what's often termed smart growth. And it's a set of growth management practices that focus on redeveloping older areas so that we don't have as much development going out on the suburban fringe. So that's happening. This smart growth is going to be of particular importance when I start to talk about the Baltimore case. So I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that later. So older suburbs in a sense, are becoming places that are ripe for sort of redevelopment from these smart growth initiatives. So that's on the policy side, sorry. Then on the kind of side of the more urban design folks who are interested in this idea is some of the most active researchers in this field are probably Ellen Dunham-Jones and June Williamson, who've been talking about how to think about ways of retrofitting our suburbs, and they've been documenting various examples of this retrofitting and this desire, in a sense, to make suburbs more like cities. And they've been documenting the redevelopment of vacant big box stores, dead malls, underutilized kind of commercial strips, outdated office parks, and so on. And they've been identifying examples of this type of retrofitting throughout the United States. So one of the things that they've sort of tried to understand some of these processes that they've been identifying in these examples they've uncovered, they describe this idea of re-inhabitation, so the adaptive reuse of older retail sites into so often public use facilities such as libraries, other government offices, and also regreening, so putting more green space and civic spaces into these suburban areas. And then finally a kind of redevelopment, which is sort of a more larger scale transformation from a single use environment to a much more multi-use configuration. So this is sort of how they've been thinking about this suburban retrofitting. But I think this is another form of suburban redevelopment that's happening. And this is a sort of so on the one hand, we have an emphasis on density and an emphasis on mixed use. And the other sort of side of this is a sort of a mansionization process that's happening. And I kind of love this photo because it's so obnoxious. But and I tried to pick the most obnoxious one of these so I could get a kind of a reaction from you guys. But this is this mansionization. This is in Arlington, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., a sort of post-war suburb. And obviously somebody wanted a fairly bigger kind of house, so they stuck this in the middle of this this post-war development. And what's interesting, I think, is that this is also a process that's going on in Australia. When we were in Sydney, we found they call it knock down and rebuild, and it's a similar kind of issue where they have similar size housing actually that's getting transformed in similar ways. So this is sort of an interesting kind of dynamic going on in a kind of larger global scale. And then there's this as well. And so this is actually a photograph from the New York Times when the 50th anniversary of Levittown in New York, and they documented how this place was sort of changing. And so if you think about this as the original kind of post-war structure, and somebody's added a new second story to this structure. So this is a sort of an interesting dynamic of another type of expansion of the individual kind of housing. So in these cases, in both the mansionization process that I showed and in this kind of additions onto housing, so there's an interesting book by this woman called Barbara Kelly who kind of looks at Levittown and the history of Levittown, and she sort of describes how this place has been altered and changed by individual owners of single-family housing that are actively shaping their neighborhoods and communities. And she suggests that homeowners are actually kind of co-producers of the environment. And I think we may not we may neglect this element of redevelopment or transformation, especially kind of, I think, within a kind of suburban context, how people are constantly shaping their environment. So, as I mentioned, on the one hand, we have a sort of suburban redevelopment that is asking for more density, more mixed use, and on the other hand, we have an expansion of single-family housing into much larger structures, either through this tear-down process or through this, these additions going on. So in our examination of Baltimore, we decided to try to come up with some definitions of these two processes. And this sort of took us a while. It's surprising how anyway, I won't go into the details, but it was sort of trying to figure out how we would measure and identify these two processes in our work. So essentially, we sort of stuck with what I'm going to talk about is more on the residential end of things. So most of what we're talking about is residential redevelopment. And so we sort of describe retrofitting as sort of new residential construction on a kind of a larger scale, right? Maybe a sort of a subdivision or a larger kind of complex in areas that are already existing developed suburbs where you have existing kind of infrastructure. And it's to create, in a sense, either more density or in some cases, that new residential construction is part of a mixed-use community, right? So this is sort of one aspect of the redevelopment that I'm going to talk about. The other part of this redevelopment is this residential rehabilitation, which is sort of looking at much more of an individual homeowner's expansion or tearing down of original structure or an addition, repair, or maintenance of their own homes. So I'm going to talk about both these processes in the Baltimore context. So try to remember them because they're going to get confusing. The retrofitting versus rehabilitation, I hope it doesn't get too confusing. Okay, so Baltimore. What I don't know if any of you guys have ever been to Baltimore. Probably to the city of Baltimore here, to the Inner Harbor if you have been, and you've seen the sort of touristy spots. Well, basically, what I'm going to talk about is this county that's surrounding the city of Baltimore, a suburban county. And what's kind of interesting about Baltimore County from a planning perspective is that they have an urban growth boundary, which you see, it's outlined here in this white. So they have had this boundary since 1967, which is kind of interesting. So that has enabled them to target their growth to within this boundary. And so if you ever go up 83 through Baltimore County, you will hit Pennsylvania. And it's very interesting because you'll be in dense kind of suburbs or whatever. You'll drive up through on the highway and everything is rural. And then you will hit the Pennsylvania border and you'll see sprawl. It's all this leapfrog kind of development that's going on in the Pennsylvania area. So what's also interesting about Baltimore and what's interesting about Maryland in general is that it has a very strong county government structure. And this becomes really important from a land use zoning perspective and why they've been so successful, I think, at keeping and maintaining their growth. So even though I have these various suburbs outlined here, they are not incorporated areas. They are suburban communities, but they don't have their own local government, right? So what's interesting in this case is that all of the zoning and land use regulation is done at the county level. So you don't have different zoning for this suburb versus this suburb versus this suburb, right? So I think that's helped it to keep its growth contained through its zoning regulation that way. So as a smart growth county, it is also it's located in Maryland, which is probably the poster child for smart growth legislation at a state level, which was done in 1997. And what the state's smart growth policy does, in the case of Baltimore County, that state policy says we will fund infrastructure for development only if it occurs within this growth boundary. So the state is providing incentives, further incentives to keep growth contained. So it's been managing that. And part of what the smart growth legislation and the county do is, rather than develop out here, we'll redevelop what we kind of already have. So we may, if we need to expand because of population, we'll get denser, right? So they have to sort of redevelop. So that's where it's been managing its growth. Also in the 1990s, it started to consider this issue of suburban decline. And it created an Office of Community Conservation back in 1995, where it was targeting its public resources both at the state and the county level, and also trying to leverage private investment to revitalize its older suburban communities. So on the one hand, it's been managing its growth, and on the other hand, it's been trying to deal with its suburban decline, which is why I kind of put this graphic back in here, so you can see this relationship between redevelopment and these various kind of policies, right? So one of the things I'm happy to talk to people about the individual kind of planning tools that they've used. There's so much going on in terms of how they're trying to manage growth and decline that I'm not going to go into tremendous amount of detail tonight with the planning kind of aspect of it, but sort of consider more just what exactly is this redevelopment look like. Okay, so, and I'll talk a little bit about some of these suburbs as I kind of go through this talk. One of the things to note before I do that, because I'm going to talk mostly about this suburb of Towson, and I'm going to talk mostly about this area around here for the talk. So I do want to say something about some of the suburbs which I won't touch on, because I think this is going to be important at the very end. So there's a couple of African American suburbs in fairly majority African American suburban areas of Lochgarn and Woodlawn, and a growing one here in Rosedale that it'll become important later when we get into another part of that part of the talk. Okay. So what did we do? We started to say, okay, let's try to figure out how we can measure, try to understand what's happening in terms of this suburban redevelopment. And we looked at permit data, and we got data from the the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, which is basically the metropolitan planning organization, the equivalent of like MORPC, to give us permit data. It was geocoded, so we could find out exactly which addresses where this redevelopment or where these permits were utilized, and we focused on the years from 2000 to 2014. So we looked at permits for new construction, so anything new that was occurring, and again, this is residential only. We have the data for commercial, we just haven't gotten into that yet. But so it's new construction, or it's any additions or repairs or alterations that are taking place on these properties. We also interviewed the various planners to talk to them about some of their redevelopment initiatives. We did field visits to these various sites to kind of see what was going on, and we kind of looked at a lot of documents to understand what's happening in the county. Okay, this graphic is actually for Karen Lewis, because I really like my data visualization. I love the circles that I drew. They're really kind of very sophisticated, right? I'm only kidding. So we can talk. I think I'm going to need some help somehow. But anyway, so this, I had to throw this up because I just thought that was so, you know. So to just clarify, this is a whole statistical analysis that everyone, if you're not going to fall asleep now, you would definitely fall asleep if I start describing that, so I won't. But what you just want to take from this is that these black squares are areas where you see a concentration of, in this case, residential rehabilitation. So in other words, again, I'll remind you that rehabilitation, for those of you who weren't listening, no, I'm kidding, the addition, repairs, or any kind of to existing kind of structures that homeowners might do, right? So these squares here are where you're seeing a concentration of that. And I'm going to talk about 2 examples because we only have a certain amount of time to describe what's happening in all of these places. So the first place I'm going to talk about is this area here of Towson. So this is a suburb, a residential community within Towson called Stoneleigh, which is, or Stoneleigh. But anyway, that is a historic district within this suburb. And this is a typical kind of housing stock within it. And we sort of were able to measure, and I have some of this data here now after losing myself. So we found that about 51 homes within this area of about 400 houses had upgraded, and over the 10-year period that we were looking at, right, they invested over all those time frames about $5 million, right, into this community. So you can't, this is sort of working out, if you were to spread that across the entire kind of suburban area, it's about $100,000 a house, right? So it's a lot of reinvestment and things going on in this community. Now, one of the things that has been described in other places, like Chicago, for instance, is that some historic communities in the suburbs of Chicago, some of their mansions there were torn down and put newer mansions on them. So this is not going on in this community. This is a community that's really reinvesting in the existing stock. They're not tearing anything down, which will keep the historic preservation people very happy. So what's also interesting about this community, and I think in my other work I've found some similar kinds of findings, some of these older suburbs never experience any kind of decline, right? They never really experience any type of disinvestment. So these places, when they were first built, were very well-to-do, solidly middle-class, upper middle class, and have remained so over these 100 years, right? So it's, I think, a very interesting area ripe for kind of research in thinking about what it is about these places that still remain so attractive to folks. But there's a consistent kind of valorization of these suburbs. Another kind of research topic for any PhD student out there. The map again, because I just love these little circles. I'm going to now talk about this Middle River suburb, a slightly different type of environment. So here you're seeing, this is more of a white, working class, waterfront community. And it has experienced similar types of processes, but in this case, many of these smaller structures, these little post-war homes, are being replaced by much bigger places. And so sometimes bigger, like that, sometimes like this. And this is an individual residence. Like, I was so shocked. I thought it was a multi-family, but it's not. So this is another form of sort of rehabilitation, I think, but also quite a different one, because Middle River, Essex, and those places that are in the southeast part of the county have a very long manufacturing history. These areas were the location of companies such as Bethlehem Steel. They were General Motors, the soap company, Lever Brothers was there. And they became a hub for a lot of industry and distribution activity. But like many other places of manufacturing, they have lost their manufacturing base. Bethlehem Steel has closed down, and various kinds of effects from that, such as large-scale physical deterioration and economic decline and unemployment. So these suburbs still have, in some ways, a strong kind of working class identity, but I think they struggle a lot to reimagine themselves in a new economy, and are really struggling to sort of get reinvestment into their community. So as this image sort of demonstrates, I think, is that especially along the water's edge and along the kind of waterfront, these new developments are becoming in many ways, very luxury, large scale, or large kind of structures. And they kind of sit next to these boxy kind of post-war sort of suburban homes, and it's a very interesting place to drive around and kind of look at that. So one of the things to note, though, is that there was a storm that did come through here, a tropical storm back in 2003. So there was a lot of these communities suffered a lot in terms of there was some destruction of some of this housing and a replacement. So there was some code to make these structures elevated, but in many ways they became also much, much bigger and very expensive. And so in this community now, you see some of these homes selling for like $1 million. So I think this process is a little bit different to the other sort of historic preservation process, and in many ways, I think a form of suburban gentrification may be going on in this area. Okay, so alongside suburban rehabilitation, we have some residential retrofitting. It's a different map, and it is the circles again. And this map is more on, it's about new construction and on a larger sort of scale. So not individual homeowners, but actual much more developer-led and policy-led redevelopment that's larger scale subdivisions or much bigger kind of complexes. So I want to talk a little bit about this area again of Towson in this conversation. And so this is some of the redevelopment that's happening in Towson. And Towson is actually the center of Baltimore County's government. It has a very strong employment center. It has lots of commercial development and retail space. It has a core downtown kind of area. And the Towson Mall has been totally refurbished to make it much more walkable spaces. So this is only one kind of element of the types of density that's entering into this particular suburban area, very similar to probably what might be happening in, say, Dublin, but I think in many ways a little bit more walkable environment than what you're seeing in a kind of Dublin context. So this is some of the redevelopment that we saw there, and this is their kind of this is their mall that they refurbished from it was built initially in the 1970s, so trying to create a much more walkable type of spaces. So these developments that you see here, these previous kind of apartment complexes, are fairly expensive. So you rent one of these apartments for about $1,600 to maybe $2,200 a month to rent in these places. And what I think is important, and I'll get back to this a little bit later, but much of the redevelopment that's happening in this downtown part of this suburb has not really considered some of the housing affordability questions, which I'll get back to a little bit later. It's much more high-end type of redevelopment. So in many ways, when we talk to the planners about this type of redevelopment that they're doing there, they have initiated planned urban or planned unit development zones, various various sort of planning tools where they're really embracing a kind of new urbanist philosophy, highlighting the creation of a mixed-use environments within this kind of context. And I think Towson acts as a really interesting example of a kind of post-suburb. And what I mean by that is that it's redeveloping in its sort of sections of it. And then there's other parts of it that have maintained this residential suburban kind of character. And sometimes there can be kind of tension within this sort of evolution. And if you think about some of the things that may be going on, for example, in Upper Arlington, where you see a lot of emphasis on trying to make more density and redevelop certain sections, but also certain people in the community wanting to stay fairly kind of residential. It's a sort of a similar type of environment. Only I think Towson is a lot more developed. So this is another type of retrofitting that I'm going to talk about is in here in Middle River. And this is sort of interesting kind of problem, I think, and one that's not unique to what's been happening in this particular suburb of Middle River. So this is an example, and this is just one example of many that we found in our work, is that this was originally a sort of subsidized housing development called Kingsley Park. And Kingsley Park had suffered from lots of problems. It was built in the 1940s. It had an awful lot of problems of deterioration of the housing complex, the apartment complex, had a lot of drug and crime going on within it. And most of the project of Kingsley Park was a project-based Section 8 owned by HUD development. And so in the kind of, I think it was in about 2004, when they started to have negotiations around what to do with this particular development. It's sort of interesting. It was owned by the property owner who still owed a lot of money to HUD, or still had a huge kind of mortgage, but was getting these subsidized rents coming in through the project-based sort of Section 8. And in 2004, HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, along with the county and this Landex property developers, they sort of reached an agreement where HUD actually forgave Landex its $11 million loan on the property, and then the deed was transferred back to HUD. HUD sold the development to Baltimore County for $10, and then Baltimore County put it out for bid to get redeveloped, and this was the results of that redevelopment process. And so within this context, this is an area now called Renaissance Square, and it has lots of townhomes in it. It has 48, it has 67 single-family housing, and it has a sort of senior housing in here apartment complex that is subsidized, but all the remaining kind of housing is a sort of market rate development. So I think this type of redevelopment, when we went around and talked to folks and tried to understand what was happening in some of these places, this type of redevelopment was pretty common in these white working class communities, where a lot of the subsidized units were being torn down and this type of market rate development was coming in. So to kind of try to sum up a little bit here before I sort of do the so what part, there's individual kind of level rehabbing that's happening in older, sort of more historic streetcar type suburbs and in sort of white working class communities. You're starting to see a larger scale kind of retrofitting that has occurred in many of these older edge type city type of developments like Towson. But also some larger scale retrofitting in some of these white working class suburbs, which often leads to the demolition of subsidized apartments replaced by this market rate housing. So what is sort of, I think, missing from this conversation and this picture about suburban redevelopment is the effect that it has on housing affordability in certain places. And so I think that there hasn't been, in lots of this redevelopment that's been occurring, there's been two processes, I think. One has been really displacement of poor people from some of these subsidized units, and they've been given Section 8 vouchers to go figure out where to go in the private market. And the second part, I think, is an exclusion of certain income groups in some of these suburban retrofitting developments. So what you're seeing, I think, is a real pattern of uneven redevelopment that's happening across the suburban sort of space that has been, I think, lacking in the conversation about suburban retrofitting and suburban redevelopment in general. And what I want to sort of point out is, I get back to these maps all the time, but you will see that in these two black majority African American suburbs, and this is another one sort of over here, there's really not a whole lot of reinvestment happening in general. And this is mostly also the case with individual homeowners having the ability to rehab or reinvest in their communities. So while we see reinvestment happening in certain places, we don't see it in others. And when we do see suburban redevelopment happening, we are often seeing it being a displacement of certain populations and an exclusion of certain populations. So I will end my talk there and be happy to take questions. To build demand for that?
Well, what happens in those cases when there is no demand? Do they just let them go? What is
Yeah.
Is the redevelopment or the retrofitting we're seeing the product of growth pressures,
right,
or demand pressures?
Right.
And what about places where there is no growth going on?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is a big issue. I think. I remember when George Galster came and spoke about suburban decline in Detroit. He sort of suggested that in some ways there's an overproduction of an oversupply of housing. Maybe potentially, I think the growth management is an important kind of element, right? Because you could see, I think one of the regions in the country, the only one is really declining is kind of Cleveland, right? That's the whole region is not. Sometimes I think the cities or inner suburbs will decline because people are moving, because you're allowing development to happen in other places, right? So there is kind of growth on some level, but it's just not encouraging that growth to happen in existing kind of places, but actually allowing growth to happen on the fringe. Now, I'm not as familiar with St. Louis in particular, but I think managing growth is a really important aspect of this. And I think it does allow for this redevelopment to occur. Because I think if Baltimore County didn't have a growth boundary, you mightn't see that level of pressure to redevelop in the way that it is. So I think that's where I think it's kind of an important growth management issue. So I'm not against managing growth, by the way. I'm not against. I think what I'm suggesting is that if we are going to allow redevelopment, we have to consider issues of housing affordability and inclusion, and having. You can't just redevelop for a particular kind of market all the time, but actually try to incorporate others into that redevelopment. Yeah.
So I'm curious, following up on Rose's question, what happened to the population over this period from 2000 to 2014 in these individual communities? So you're seeing a lot of reinvestment, particularly in Towson.
Mm-hmm.
What happened with the population? Are there actually more people, fewer people?
Yeah. Some places have seen population decline, like some of these suburbs have. some of these older suburban areas. Towson is not one of those. But there has been a changing demographics, changing kind of racial composition, and some immigration in some of these places. But in general, and so that's fueling some of the growth as well, is being fueled by some of those demographic shifts. But in some places, there's also a kind of problem of an aging population and not enough people coming in to potentially kind of replace. So some of the suburbs, let me see if I can. So some of these guys here are really struggling with population aging and not a kind of replacement happening. And some of those, yeah.
One of the things I appreciate about your research about Baltimore is how easy it is to correlate even to Columbus.
Right.
Even in the work that you're doing in Highland Park, we see very similar trends.
Mm-hmm.
Neighborhoods are redeveloping,
Mm-hmm.
low-income people are being moved out because of the trend to change supportive housing into market housing.
Right.
And one of the things I'm surprised by is even how similar the housing looks.
Yeah, yeah.
Which, in my evaluation, is really without identity. So I was surprised that what a Baltimore neighborhood looks like is
Yeah, yeah.
so much like what a renovated Columbus neighborhood looks like. So I wonder if in your research, I'm curious about two areas,
Mm-hmm.
whether they come up or not, whether you're interested in them and what you're finding. One is conditions of neighborhood identity. Is there identity in the quality of the neighborhood beyond what I'm seeing superficially in the building form?
Mm-hmm.
And the other is something that I think we're aware of generally. It has to do with the immigration. How many non-American communities are forming and growing as suburban areas get redeveloped?
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you found in Baltimore?
Yeah, certainly. I think like this area here of Pikesville is seeing a lot of Russian immigration, Russian Jewish immigration, which is fueling actually a lot of their revitalization. And I think immigrants can play a strong role there in terms of revitalizing places. So yes, but otherwise, relative to like, so Baltimore is fairly close to Washington, D.C. It hasn't seen as much immigration as what you're seeing in Washington, D.C., for example, in its suburbs. But yes, the immigration is kind of an aspect of this for that particular suburb. In terms of identity, I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, if I think about those arts and crafts kind of housing and those historic kind of districts, this is really interesting to me how they kind of, it sort of goes against the grain of what people are saying about suburban decline. So a lot of people have sort of speculated why are suburbs declining? And so one of the theories that's out there is that it's just a life cycle process, right? It's just a matter of aging, and the housing stock ages, right? And traditionally, this has been, in some cases, evidence of this, where you see aging housing stock, and people will say, okay, will I reinvest in that housing stock, or should I just buy a new house? And they might buy a new house further out, and poorer people will move into that, right? So this is a sort of a filtering of housing stock process, right? But this goes against that idea, because people are deciding to reinvest in those particular houses in that particular neighborhood. And the question becomes it's never experiencing that decline and then a redevelopment in that sort of same way.
So
Yeah.
looking at your data, and also thinking about the timeline that you're doing this. So the timeline for your data is 2004 through 2014.
Yeah.
And in the middle of that,
Right.
something big happened.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
We had a crisis,
Right.
a mortgage crisis.
Right.
And so all of this redevelopment, residential rehabilitation rather, happens because of lending.
Mm-hmm.
And subprime loans first became very popular
Right.
in rehabilitation loans.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if you've looked at
Yeah.
But also, what I think is interesting is the lack of lending and the lack of rehabilitation in the minority
Yeah.
communities, and I wonder what that has to do with access to credit.
Yeah, well, that's a really great. So there's a new book that's come out about these African American suburbs of Baltimore County. I can't remember the name of it, but they found that a lot of the foreclosure crisis affected above all the other places, above all the other suburbs. That the foreclosure crisis really hit these two communities in Baltimore. So that's, I think, a big kind of issue. So myself and Whitney actually looked at this data for 2004. We did 2004 to 2014. I don't think we've done it for other dates, but I think there's a similar sort of pattern that emerges when we looked at just the 10-year period. But I think, yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, I don't think you'll see as much clustering, but you'll still probably see in some cases this similar types of places are seeing it. But yeah, that's a good point. We could look at that. Any questions? Yes, Towson for sure, and here. So this is where I went to university, Catonsville, so I kind of know what's going on here. Lots of reinvestment that's happening, and some of this is in the same context. It has some similar neighborhoods that look like Stoneleigh, the historic kind of neighborhoods, but some of this is also to cater to the student population. They've sort of modifying homes to turn them into, different kind of, not apartments, but because they can't really do that, but catering to, the student body, I think. But what's interesting about Catonsville, I think, in terms of the students, is it's more of a commuter campus. It's not as heavily, so the types of housing that you see around the campus is actually pretty nice relative to what you might see it's getting a little better probably around Ohio State, but it's not most of the people kind of commute. So some of this is also faculty kind of living in this community, and it's that type of reinvestment. But yes, definitely universities do matter with this.
Other questions?
Thank you.
So I just want to tell you before we applaud that the reception tonight is in the back, not in the front. So don't go that way. Go that way. And now let's thank Professor Hanlon.
Thank you.